Okay, so my name is Rahman Dağ, and I'm gonna moderate this keynote speech. Will be given by the Dr. Jana Puglierin. Yeah? Okay, right pronunciation. Before we starting, I would like to give some information about her because she is quite interesting to have a keynote speaker. He has worked at universities and some advisor positions, and also working at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And when I checked her background, I see that she has worked as a practitioner and also theoretical, and also acted as an advisor for the Bundestag. Yeah, so I think this working experience will give her a quite understanding of how the world order is going. So she is also head of the project Reorder. It means a lot, I think, but I don't want to delve into this issue. So I am sure that that will be quite interesting keynote speech. So I will give the floor to Dr. Jana. If you don't mind, could you please keep it for 30 minutes? I don't want to be the same situation as before. Then we will have 15 minutes for question, okay? Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahman, and good morning, everybody. I'm actually delighted to be here, and I thank you very much for the invitation to this prestigious conference. Venice has a very special place in my heart. It's my father's family's origin. My grandfather was born in a small town close to Treviso called Asolo in the Veneto, and my last name is actually from here, from Venice. And I've spent the most wonderful time here at Ca' Foscari as an Erasmus student in 2002. I have very fond memories, and it's an enormous pleasure to be back. I've been back only once ever since, and that is 18 years ago, so for me, this is really a great occasion. But I'm also honored to talk to you today because I left academia more than a decade ago, and I became a think tanker after some period in the German Bundestag. And I often think back and I'm wondering whether I've made the right choice. And I'm grateful that at least for the duration of this conference, I can delve back into the academic world. I really liked Louis's keynote speech because I think our two talks complement each other very well. I'll touch upon some of the things that he has talked about, and I think I'll add some other perspectives. So my topic is Europe in a changing world order, and I'll start with the world and then zoom into Europe. I am afraid I will be rather gloomy, so brace yourself. And I am not using any PowerPoint, so you're stuck with me only. I need to concentrate on what I say. I start with the changing order, or more accurately, as Louis, I think, has put it as well, the disorder that we are facing. Antonio Gramsci wrote in 1930, "The old is dying, and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear." My argument is that we are actually in a similar situation and that we are facing an in-between moment. We are at the end of something old and the beginning of something new, but the old somewhat still is, and the new is still in the making. So the beginning of the war against Ukraine is considered a turning point in history in my country, Germany, and in most of Europe, not so much in other parts of the world. But such turning points or sea changers never occur in a vacuum. In retrospect, I think it's easy to see how much the respective existing order had already eroded before those events occurred that took most observers completely by surprise at the time they happened and made the world a different place. And I think the serious consequences of these respective events were also still largely unknown at the time they occurred. Take, for example, the end of the Cold War, which was much more than the fall of the Berlin Wall. Take the French Revolution, that was not just the storming of the Bastille, but also La Terreur that came thereafter. And I think we in Europe are at the moment at such a turning point. But the radical challenges that are challenging the international system as it has occurred after the end of the Cold War are already there for quite some time. First, I think there is the erosion of the international organizations and multilateral cooperation. In the eyes of many low-income and emerging economies, the UN and its sub-organizations have failed to provide effective responses to the global financial crisis, to climate change, and COVID-19. And in their eyes, they have therefore lost legitimacy. Those countries also very often point to the lack of equitable representation in these institutions. But it's not so much only the frustration of the so-called Global South that contributes to the erosion of international institutions. In recent years, we have seen great power rivalry between the United States and China that has paralyzed the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, and has turned them actually into arenas of national power politics and great power competition, especially during the Trump years. Under Trump, and Luis mentioned this, the US withdrew from the Paris Agreement, from the Iran deal, and Trump announced his willingness to withdraw from the WHO. China, on the other hand, is trying to infiltrate these very institutions and build an alternative international order from within, which Luis has talked about at length. In turn, the multilateral system has become increasingly fragmented, and ever more countries are turning to exclusive regional and ideological clubs, so like the G7 or BRICS Plus. We talk about friendshoring and nearshoring in the West, and the Global South and the rich North have drifted ever further apart. Take Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Although most of the countries of the so-called Global South voted to condemn Russia in the UN General Assembly back after the war started, few of those countries actually joined the sanctions imposed by the West or provide military support to Ukraine. Many European diplomats, and I know that by personal experience because I've interviewed them in Geneva in January 2023, so many of these European diplomats were surprised how hard it was to find support for the resolutions when Russia's rule-breaking to us Europeans was so obvious. So I think the very idea of the rules-based international order has lost enormous credibility at the global stage. Many countries in Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East, and Asia argue that this order has been dominated by the West, and I think we've just heard this argument also in a question. Those countries argue that the system has not worked for them and that it's unequal, discriminatory, and unrepresentative. They point out that the United States and European countries themselves have broken or undermined the rules on so many occasions, from the invasions of Iraq and Libya to the Green Deal's discriminatory measures. Many developing countries therefore cannot relate to the West's call to jointly defend the rules-based international order against Russian aggression. Meanwhile, the Security Council is completely paralyzed and can no longer secure or restore peace, now in Ukraine, but before that in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq. While some in the US and Europe talk about a new Cold War between the US and China, or a contest of democracies against the world's autocracies as the new global framework, many countries, including in Europe, refuse to accept this binary view. For them, the world is increasingly multipolar, not only for China, also I think for many other countries, and they don't want to be dragged into a new Cold War. Countries like India, Turkey, South Africa, Nigeria, or Brazil see themselves as sovereign powers with the right to build their own relationships, not as swing states that need to take sides. They want to retain the ability to pursue international relations with all as best serves their individual interests. And for me, this transactionalism is one of the most striking new features of global disorder. Countries And increasingly also countries in the West don't want to align themselves with any camp any longer, and they don't want to choose. They want to cooperate with this camp today and with the other camp tomorrow, as suits their own best interests. Another feature of the new global disorder is increasing fragmentation, deglobalization, non-tariff barriers, export restrictions, for example, on critical technology. And the world is becoming ever more protectionist, including in the United States and Europe. Think about the IRA or the European Green Deal, or in increasing measures for investment screening. And this is also, and I think this for the Europeans is a very traumatic experience, this is also because interconnectedness and interdependence as such can turn into weapons once they become asymmetrical. And Luis has mentioned this as well. Germany, my country, has experienced this very intensively after the war against Ukraine started with its dependency on cheap Russian energy. So those ties that were meant to bring us closer together in the world are also can also be directed against us. So why is this also frightening to us Europeans? The erosion of the rules-based order as we know it, and multilateralism as such, poses a major challenge for us. The idea of a system characterized by the strength of the law and not the law of the strongest is part of the European DNA. Europeans are extremely globally interconnected. Their growth, prosperity, and economic stability depends largely on a functioning multilateral trading system. And our international influence is based on economic strength, not so much on military power. In the past, we Europeans have been successful in advancing our global agenda through multilateral processes and institutions. However, I think nowadays we need to realize that we are increasingly home alone with the ideas about the rules and the principles of this international order. The EU's very founding concept is the idea that the results of international cooperation are divisible, that international politics is not about who benefits the most, but about everybody benefiting and about cooperation making everybody better off. The world is not a zero-sum game as we thought. And now Europeans must recognize increasingly that the world has changed dramatically, but also that the world does not see us Europeans like we tend to see ourselves. So basically as benign do-gooders that want to do trade with the world. I think that's not how we are perceived by especially many countries in the so-called global south. The reality today is that players such as Russia and especially China are becoming more attractive to many non-Western countries. Both are clearly rejecting the existing rules-based international order. Russia wants to diminish it basically altogether. China is seeking to mold the rules around its own ambitions to build a new global order with Beijing at its center, making the world safe for the Communist Party. But in their rejection of the existing system, as we have benefited greatly from, both Russia and China strike a chord with those countries that also feel that this system that we love so much has not delivered for them. We in Europe talk a lot about decoupling, and I think it was mentioned in Luis's talk. And especially in Germany, many politicians always say, oh, we don't want to decouple from China. At max, we want to de-risk. But China is actually decoupling from us already. Decoupling in China is a reality in Chinese economic policy. China seeks to replace foreign-made products in China by domestic manufacturers. China's technology matures in every sector. And since 2013, since Xi came into power, China has made a very disruptive policy shift. China's declared goal nowadays is to become less dependent on international imports and technology transfers, and at the same time increase the dependence of international production chains on China. So making itself less dependent on the world, making the world more dependent on China. And already at the end of 2020, Xi Jinping formulated very clearly that China must also prepare to use its own economy as a weapon. In Europe, we have these well-known cases of telecommunications and mobile phone industries. Huawei is always kind of the example that everybody knows. But I think we should be much more aware when it comes to solar and wind energy, to batteries, and everything that is related to our green energy transition. China is investing more in the area of green energy than any other country in the world. The country is the world's largest manufacturer, exporter, and installer of solar modules, wind turbines, and electric vehicles, and holds a strong position in the supply chain of practically all raw materials and technologies for clean energy. China therefore plays a crucial role in the European energy transition. The use of renewable energy sources for Europe is one of the key factors in achieving the Paris climate targets, and without China, we can forget about all of this. But caution is needed with regard to the consequences of import dependency and a lack of diversification. When it comes to energy security in relation to renewable energies, the main issue is access to critical materials and minerals and components that are needed to manufacture renewable energy technologies. Secure, resilient, and sustainable supply chains for these technologies are crucial. And today, we are already overly dependent on China. To give you just one example, which I think is always striking, China accounts for over 70% of global polysilicon production capacity. And this figure is expected to rise to over 90% in the coming years. Without this intermediate product, no one can produce the market-leading crystalline silicon solar cell. Solar modules made of crystalline silicon are the predominant technology and account for around 95% of the photovoltaic capacity installed worldwide. A delivery boycott would hit Europe hard, and this scenario is not fiction. China has already used raw earth, such as a political lever against Japan in the past. So, in view of Europe's ambitious plans to become kind of green and to expand renewable energies, China is an indispensable partner. At the same time, we need to find the right balance between security and openness and economic resilience. In addition, and I don't go into this, there is the looming Taiwan threat, and there is the potential military confrontation in the Indo-Pacific. And the consequence of such a military confrontation would outweigh the economic impact of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Briefly talking about Russia, I think already after the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the imposition of Western sanctions, Moscow had already dramatically altered its focus towards Beijing. We have not been aware of that largely, but it had already happened. And it was not only reflected in cheaper gas supplies, but also in the sales of modern weapon systems to China and joint military exercises. After Russia launched the full invasion of Ukraine, its dependence on China increased sharply, and the two countries moved closer together. Economic relations with Beijing are keeping the Russian system running. China actively fuels Russia's war economy and fills its war chest every day. And even if, according to our knowledge, Russia is not supplying military goods to Russia, we see an increasing export of dual-use products that can be used for civilian and military purposes. So far, China has hugely benefited from Russia's war of aggression in a variety of ways. Moscow is increasingly becoming a junior partner with nuclear weapons and a comfortable seat on the UN Security Council, while from a Chinese perspective, the United States remains tied down in Europe and is unable to concentrate its political, economic, and military resources on Asia, as it has originally planned. As long as this war does not endanger Putin's strong position, its continuation is by no means a major problem from a Chinese perspective. On the contrary, it plays into the Chinese hands in its effort to take the US's place at the center of the international system. And even if China and Russia do indeed differ when it comes to their various ideas of a post-American world, both are united that they want an alternative to the existing international order. And we've just seen the quote on screen that, as Xi told Putin, right now we are witnessing changes, the likes of which we have not seen in 100 years, and we are the ones driving these changes forward. Let me now briefly zoom into the European security order, or the ruins of it, because there is no order left. And I think talking about a turning point in a way gets it wrong because even long before 24th of February 2022, there were more than enough signs that the Kremlin no longer felt bound by the established principles of the European security order, by the Charter of Paris, the Helsinki Final Act, the Budapest Memorandum, the NATO-Russia Founding Act, even if, just to remember everybody, the Soviet Union and Russia have recognized all of these principles and every treaty. But Russia's perception already since 2014 or earlier was that it has been pushed more and more to the periphery, and it has kept small in a European order dominated by an expansive European Union and an expansive NATO, without actually having the possibility to decisively shape this order. So therefore, Russia, I think for a long time, has the perception that the European security system, as it was set up, was not inclusive, but a construct of the West that was imposed on Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And of course, that contrasts sharply with how the EU and NATO countries see this. And that brings me to the conclusion that regardless of how the war against Ukraine ends, I think we can safely assume that a confrontation with Russia is the new framework for Europe's security architecture. There is no going back to the status quo ante. There is no let's undo this and basically kind of start again where we've left things in, 2009. Of course, there are unknown unknowns that nobody can foresee. How stable is the Russian system? How stable is Putin? But I think we can safely assume that there is no new Gorbachev in the waiting, and that we should not bet on domestic transformations in Russia, although they can, of course, happen overnight, as with the Soviet Union. Changes happen gradually and then suddenly, and kind of we wake up one morning and then we talk about its Zeitenwende. But because Russia is so closed and you cannot access it and you cannot have any good insight of what is happening, we just don't know. But I think no matter how and when the war against Ukraine ends, whether it will be frozen or protected, we will probably not see a real peace, a reconciliation process, or Russia coming to terms with its war crimes. So a frozen conflict, a ceasefire, or a protracted war are more likely for the next years, I think. And even if Russia were to be defeated, and probably even after Putin's end, it is unlikely that Russia would integrate into the European framework as a normal country as we see it. It will not become a second Poland or a second Czech Republic. And I think we would do ourselves a favor if we looked closely at the treaties of the 17th December 2021, which Russia presented to the United States and NATO, because they make very clear that Russia is not only concerned about Ukraine. They, in these treaties, want that the stationing of troops outside of a country's own territory should be prohibited if one of the parties to the treaty feels threatened, and it wants to undo basically NATO's military enlargement after 1997. Those countries should no longer receive military support. In effect, what Russia wants is an end to NATO. It wants no American troops in Europe. It wants an end to nuclear sharing with the Americans, while Russia is still allowed to continue stationing nuclear weapons, of course. So I think a new agreement with Moscow on a European Security Order 2.0, a new Helsinki or whatever, is not to be expected. There is just no common base for it. Security in Europe for the foreseeable future needs to be organized against Russia and not with Russia. So, just to keep things a little short, because I think you are getting nervous, Rahman. So, I think just to summarize, this is not a good outlook for us. I think we don't see a new wave of disarmament and arms control. Instead, we see a return of the nuclear age. We see at the same time how new technologies and new spaces like cyberspace, outer space will become increasingly important for modern warfare. In all this, the role of the United States is crucial for European security still. Without the United States, Europe would be unable to defend itself successfully. But let me briefly speak about the US, because there is a lot of anxiety in the room about Donald Trump and a return, and basically we should all hope for Harris. But I just want to highlight two trends that I think will hit us hard regardless of who wins the presidential elections in the United States, because Republicans and Democrats very much agree on these two trends. One is that in recent years, Republicans and Democrats have increasingly pushed in similar directions on foreign policy issues that have a strong resonance with white working-class constituencies in swing states, because that's where the elections are decided. This includes bipartisan support for promoting US manufacturing jobs in the face of international competition, kind of to bring them back home, the rejection of free trade agreements, and efforts to build greater domestic production capacity. So the protectionist trend basically goes across the aisle. The US is clearly on a trajectory towards strategic industrial policy and reshoring, and that hits Europe hard, as we have seen already with the IRA. And the second trend that we should be prepared for is that there is a bipartisan agreement on China as the main rival and the need to focus on the Indo-Pacific. Both parties differ to how they see the role of allies in this competition. A Trump administration would surely be more ready to punish Europeans if they don't play along, but I think also a Harris administration would demand greater compliance when it comes to China, and both would certainly demand a greater self-reliance when it comes to security. So this means that regardless of a Trump or a Harris win, the US will increasingly expect the EU to align its policies on China with that of the US. Any US administration will demand greater European contributions to European security to free up the US military resources for the Indo-Pacific. There will be zero tolerance for Europeans' free riding when it comes to NATO and the 2% or whatever target. So in the future, the Europeans have to play a much greater role in conventional deterrence of Russia. They will have increasingly on their own to deal with security crises in their neighborhood, in the Western Balkans, for example, or in the Mediterranean. And if we just watch closely how the war against Ukraine also affects regions in kind of North or West Africa or the Middle East through famine, for example, and if we look at the ever-escalating climate crisis, I think it's safe to say that crises and conflicts in those regions, in the periphery of Europe, in the southern periphery, will increase. And it is not sure that the US will remain committed to European security and will take an interest in the crises and conflicts that emerge. Are the Europeans capable of stepping up and doing more about this? I think theoretically, yes, but if I look at Europe at the moment, I think you can become rather depressed. If I look at my own country, Germany, I think the Chancellor is trying to keep the coalition together from falling apart. This takes all the energy. It is absolutely inward-looking, and no room, no energy for anything related to Europe, let alone the global stage. So Germany is not playing the leadership role that many expected to play. France is actually in deep domestic turmoil still with an unclear outlook. The Franco-German tandem, I think, will not drive us out of this mess for the foreseeable future. Populism is on the rise, and the readiness to compromise is declining. There is increasingly a my country first approach. But, and I end with this because I think it's so easy to become gloomy, but I think we need to remember that we are not history's plaything, that we have our destiny in our own hands. And if we Europeans want to decisively shape the new world order that is emerging and not being shaped by others, I think it is important that we do not allow ourselves to be divided. that we are much more capable to secure our own security, and that we become more resilient to the attempts of external influence. So what to do? And I think this is just a starting point for your conference, because this should be on everybody's agenda who is interested in Europe to survive this. So I think, as we said, we need to become defense capable. We need to build the European pillar in the NATO framework. We need to develop a strong UK-EU security partnership. We need to invest in our defense industry. We need to have an independent strategy for Ukraine, because the US is likely to get disengaged. Under Harris, with a different time frame, but I think money-wise and commitment-wise, the US commitment is going down. And I think no European country is prepared for the deal that Trump will bring kind of to the war. And the Europeans are completely puzzled and don't know how they could react to this and avoid that this happens over their head, and they don't have a strategy to engage Trump. I think this needs to change instantly. I think, and we need to get enlargement right, and I could talk about this forever, but I really make one last final point, because I think, and that's my big plea, there is also an opportunity for us here, for us Europeans here, because the countries I talked about in the very beginning in Africa and Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East are frustrated with the global order as it exists. And I think they want something new, but they don't necessarily want the Chinese version of things. So I think that the EU should invest much more in partnerships with the broadest possible range of countries that share the EU's concerns or interests. And I'm not talking about like-mindedness. Of course, the Europeans should privilege relationships with partners that share its values, but it needs to coexist and sometimes work with other countries too. So I think what Europe desperately needs is a new approach to the countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, and it needs to signal to those countries that it wants to create new partnerships in a way that creates value addition for them, for everybody. I think Europe's energy transition is actually a chance to do this, if it includes economic transformation also for the countries that we want to partner with, and not just cheap imports of raw materials that we no longer get from China. I think when it comes to technology transfers, Europe has a lot to offer. And I think if Europe really invests in these partnerships, and this is not easy because it's a contested field, it's a crowded field, everybody basically is traveling to those countries with charm offensives, but I think Europeans are still attractive partners for the many actors that share a common interest in a workable international system that works for everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Serhat. I have lots of questions to ask, but I see that you are eager to ask, so I will refrain myself and keep my questions with me, and first give the floor to you. But before that, okay, I'm not going to ask a question. Okay, any question, please? Rabia, microphone, please. Go ahead, Luis.
Oh, thank you for your wonderful presentation. I couldn't agree with you more. My question is, and you explained that very well, we, European, are facing two main dilemmas. And I'd like to have your comments on that. The first one is how to deal with other partners, not using our values and our principles. For instance, if you are having this partnership with India, you are not allowed to criticize the violations of human rights and Muslim minorities. Because if you criticize or say something, you will hurt the partnership. So how can you deal with these external partners from Turkey to India, South Africa, and many others that you mentioned on the Global South mainly? How can you do this without hurting our principles? On the other hand, the other dilemma is we are not having a common single voice. We talk about Europe, but we are many Europe's many voices. And I think we have two main Trojan horses in the Atlantic Alliance, Hungary and, Turkey. How can we deal with these, our allies, if they are acting in a completely different way with some of our adversaries, starting with Russia, for example? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Jana?
So I think I will not give you an answer that satisfies you because, yeah, I'm thinking about these problems now for a long time and have not found basically the one-size-fits-all answer. But when it comes to dealing with other partners and values and principles, I think, and actually in the past years I've worked a lot on this, many countries in the so-called Global South, and everybody hates the word, but just for the lack of a better one, many of those countries say, well, we believe that many of the values and principles you believe in are our values and principles too. We have a problem with you basically preaching and kind of trying to present yourself from a moral high ground that you do better than we do, and very often you don't. So you preach, but then your deeds show something different. For example, I've heard this very much after the war against Ukraine started, when it comes to energy transition and financing projects in other countries, that the West was destined not to finance was only destined to finance carbon neutral projects and to talk to everybody to abandon fossil fuels. And once the war started and Europe was in desperate need of cheap energy, there was kind of, all principles were abandoned, everything was possible again. And so I think we need to, as Europeans, become more honest and not only preach, but also stick to our own principles, being well aware that there are always dilemmas and you can never be kind of like do pure good. But I think we need to be better in acknowledging when we break our own rules and stand with our double standards. But I think when it comes to values and principles, I think there is a lot that unites us. And I've just done a project that is called the Multilateral Matchmaker. It's some sort of Tinder, if you know that, the dating app for international relations and for multilateralism. So we identified, for example, 5 policy areas like security. We looked at maritime and space security. We looked at climate change, but also on more just trade. How to solve that on the multilateral scene with a multilateral agenda. And we found that there are many countries out there that actually want the same. They are not like-minded in every single aspect, but you can work with them on specific aspects very well. Like, for example, maritime security, the security of undersea cables, all of this. And if we concentrate on these joint projects, I think there are many partners that don't ask that we kind of throw every value we have overboard, but where you can actually work very constructively together. You can maybe check it out if it interests you. It's called the Multilateral Matchmaker, and it's on the ECFR website, and you can find your ideal partner for Europe. And when it comes to values and principles, I think sometimes we need to listen to our partners better and maybe also acknowledge that our way of doing things is oftentimes not that attractive. When I was in Brazil, and you talked about Brazil a lot, I heard very often, so if the Chinese come, we have an airport. If the Europeans come, they preach, and kind of it takes 10 years to sign something, and we still don't have a road. And I think this is the perception. So I think we need to also understand that if we don't do certain things, like, for example, looking at the Mercosur trade agreement. If we don't sign it, then other countries come and do it. So I think it's a mix, but I would not say we need to abandon all our values and principles. Maybe do more concrete, or bring more concrete value to the countries, show ourselves as better partners, acknowledge that many of the values and principles that we stand for, like climate change, for example, is something that the Lula regime stands for as well. They don't need us to come there and tell them they'll protect kind of the Amazon. They are very capable of doing that themselves, so take them more seriously, but also admit that sometimes you need to, I don't know, there are dilemmas and explain, and just don't pretend that you didn't do it. When it comes to Hungary and Turkey, this is, I think, the most difficult question. In the European Union on Hungary, I have a very clear answer. I'm increasingly for a 26- approach, so just doing a lot of things without having Hungary on board, without Hungary blocking, even if it undermines the cohesion of all of the European Union, and it's not the same. But when it comes to Turkey, I'm still of the opinion that it's better to have them in the tent than outside of the tent, because I think it's easier to influence, or it's more likely that you can influence Turkey. But I'm very often also speechless and clueless, I have to admit.
Thanks a lot.
Hello.
Sorry, last two questions. One for the lady, and Taner Hocam, don't mind, I will give you the floor, another one, and you can ask your question later. And Eric, Professor Eric will ask the second question. Okay, go ahead, please. Thank you.
My name is Maria Antónia Almeida. I'm from University of Minho, Portugal. And thank you very much for both presentations. And my question is for both presenters, because you've both talked about international treaties, international organizations, and the role of China. But there's another viewpoint. It's the economic evasion of China. Regardless of the political issues that you've both explained so well, China has already invaded economically a big portion of the world. Africa, they are deciding the future of the forests and taking away the woods, and they are the major buyer for Brazil's exports. In Portugal, they control many of our most important companies, like electricity. So aren't we already invaded by China? Isn't China already ruling the world in a subtle way economically? Probably politics has gone to a second level, because this is the reality right now. They are already invading the world subtly, but so I would like your, both of the speakers today, I would like your comment on this subject. Thank you.
Very briefly, because I agree with you, and I think I mentioned it in my presentation, kind of China's strategy of decoupling, basically making China economically less dependent on the world, but the world dependent more on China. And I think, of course, this has worked already to a certain extent. In many countries, Chinese investments were seen as an alternative also to kind of Western financing. I remember an advisor to the president in Brazil telling me, well, the difference to 15 years ago is that now we have alternatives. But I think, just to end on a positive note, so I acknowledge your problem. I think it's a problem that we in the West already have. When we look at, as I said, telecommunications in my country is a nightmare. When you look at the telecom and the Deutsche Bahn, but increasingly, as I said, also green energy is very problematic. So, but that's why I think we need to be aware of the problem and really try to balance our, I'm not talking about cutting all ties with China, but right-sizing China is what I think is necessary. And what plays in our hands and to our favor as Europeans is that there is a huge China hangover already when it comes to many countries in Africa, but also in Asia is a different playing field, because in Asia countries are very worried about China, but in Africa and Latin America there is also some sort of hangover already, because they feel the debt trap that China presents, and they want that's why I think the Europeans have actually a possibility to get a foot in the door, because there is, yeah, it's less wonderful than many countries thought, and the reputation of China is, I think, already going down. So this is also our chance to present alternative business models, alternative ways of cooperation that don't take all the wealth out of the country, but basically that create value chains within the partnering country as well.
Okay, where is the microphone?
It's here, it's here.
No. Luis Thomas, would you like to reply to the question? Okay, you will talk, okay, later. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Eric Sharaev, George Mason, US. Jana, fantastic keynote. My question is, are we too pessimistic? Your speech will be perfect fit 1940 when Hitler just attacked Poland. Will be perfect fit when Russian tanks just rolling over Budapest. Will perfect fit when Africa turned to authoritarianism, all 2/3 of the leaders just turned to the military power. Will perfect fit when the Russians attacked Afghanistan. Europe, Yugoslavia was a flat world, and yet just we failed. But maybe we're just a little bit pessimistic, and we need to be more assertive and defend, as you said, more proactively and decisively what we won as liberal democracy in the past. Thank you.
Yeah, I think absolutely interesting that it comes from an American. I think the Americans are always better in optimism. Europeans, I think, traditionally more pessimistic. That's just an observation looking at cultural differences. But that's why I started kind of saying it's getting very gloomy, brace yourself. But in the end, I think the emphasis on we are not a plaything here, we are a player, or at least we have all the potential to be a player, is what needs to stick with you when you leave this room. It's not, I mean, but I think we should not kid ourselves. I think the situation is actually pretty bleak for Europeans, because, I mean, to put it very blunt or maybe simple, the Europeans have just lost, or not lost yet, but so our biggest security provider, the United States, that also, in my view, maybe we differ in this room, but enabled European integration by taking the security dilemma out of Europe and allowing the Europeans, basically under the NATO umbrella, to peacefully coexist with each other. So we are losing, or we are potentially losing the security provider, which is especially, I think, important when it comes to the nuclear dimension. But, I mean, the loss of cheap Russian energy is something that affects some countries in Europe more than others. Germany has made tremendous mistakes in the past, but I think it affects all of Europe, and it affects our competitiveness vis-à-vis, for example, American companies, because European companies now need to pay 6 to 10 times more for energy than American companies, which makes us less competitive on the international market. And also, I think China, I still remember when I was at university a long time ago, China was seen as, like India was seen as the next big thing, and China was seen as going to implode because there was no capitalism, no democracy, and either China would basically transform and become the liberal version of itself, or it would implode, and both did not happen. So I think we Europeans have also gotten many things wrong in the past. So I think there is now a reason to be maybe not bleak or pessimistic, but realistic, and look at things how they are, but still end on the, we are not a plaything here, we are still a player, we have options, we have a potential. But I think the reality is that, and I'm not an EU romanticist here, but if we don't join forces in Europe, I think, and if we are kind of melting butter in the sun, we get easily divided by whoever comes and wants to divide us.
Thank you very much. That wasn't so enthusiastic ending, but still, thank you for the speech and for the questions, and big thanks to your patience. It has been now 3 hours, and we haven't eaten and drinking anything. See you in the next session. Thank you for the participation.